Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today at this Pew Research Center hosted webinar where the topic is global climate change and what publics think about global climate change, how concerned are they, and what are they willing to do about climate change. Really excited to have you all joining us today because it's going to be a fascinating conversation driven by facts. A lot of those facts come from our own research at the Pew Research Center. A word about us, the Pew Research Center. Some of you may know, some of you may not. We consider ourselves a fact tank. You're often, I think, hearing about think tanks. We say fact tank because we're not only nonpartisan, but we're non-advocacy, which means that we don't take positions on policy issues. We don't make recommendations about what the solution should be. We're really focused on research. And a lot of that research is about what individuals and societies think about the issues of today, the issues that are shaping the future here in the United States and around the world. So again, thank you for joining us today as the center hosts this webinar discussing what is a very pertinent and pressing topic and issue, and that is climate change. We're going to look at it from several different perspectives today. Again, drawing on the research that the center has conducted. We're going to look at it from an American point of view. What is on the minds of American citizens when they think about climate change? How concerned are they? What are the things that they think need to be done about climate change? What are they willing to support in terms of action to address climate change? We're also going to look at climate change in the context of American politics as a policy issue. Where does it rank? How do people think about it in the context of all the things that are in people's minds these days? Because it's not only a world confronted by climate change, there are other pressing issues, as we know, beginning first and foremost, the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, we're going to look at the United States in a global context and draw on some of our international comparative research to understand a bit more about how public attitudes in the United States fit into that larger ecosystem of public opinion around the globe when it comes to climate change. To get all that done, I am privileged to be joined by three of my outstanding colleagues, Carrie Funk, who's the director of our Science and Society Research, Carol Doherty, who's the director of our Political Research, and Jacob Pauster, who is the Associate Director of our Global Attitudes Research. And I'll be introducing them, and you'll be hearing from them in a few moments. And we're also really pleased that we are joined today by Laura Helmuth, who is the current editor-in-chief of Scientific American, who's going to bring an additional perspective about what all this research and information means for how we think about the issue of climate change in the world today and what can be done about it. Just a note about housekeeping that I want to make clear to everyone. Today's event is being recorded, and the benefit of that is a recording will be available after the event. If you so desire to check that out, it'll be a resource on our website. And as we go through the event, there will be opportunities for you to post questions in the chat, which will be on the side of your screen. And we'll be getting to some of those questions, and hopefully many of them when we get to question and answer time. So without further ado, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce my colleague, Carrie Funk, again, director of our Science and Society Research, who will start us off on this path, this journey through the data the center has collected on the issue of climate change. So Carrie, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to walk us through just a handful of findings from Pew Research Center surveys that I think highlight where Americans stand on climate policy and related policy areas. And we're going to focus on where we're seeing some dynamics in terms of what's shifting in American public opinion as well. This has been a period of kind of active speculation, at least, around a change in presidential administrations, around a kind of a new set of legislation on the table. So it's an area where we are seeing kind of shifting reactions to that climate, to that policy climate as well. So, and we're going to just focus on where Americans sit on these issues. If we could go to the next slide, please. The thing about policy issues is that they often highlight trade-offs that people would make between really complex ideas. So this is a metric we've used over the years to try to capture one of those trade-offs. where we asked people, what would you prioritize if you could be in charge of U.S. energy supply? Would you prioritize developing alternative energy sources such as wind and solar energy, or prioritize exploring and further exploring fossil fuel energy sources? So what you're seeing here in the gray bars is that around 7 in 10 Americans in the most recent survey of spring 2021 said that they would prioritize developing alternative energy sources. But this is an area where we are seeing some shifts in public opinion. On the right-hand side, you should be seeing in the columns that there is a dip in support for that position, particularly among Republicans, the redder bars. So as of April 2021, Republicans were closely divided between these two priorities. Democrats remain very strongly in favor of prioritizing the development of alternative energy sources, roughly 9 in 10 over the past couple of years. So that shift, that really was just a 1 year shift, I just want to underscore that's not a one off kind of shift. We actually have seen it on a number of different measures. This is just an example. We asked people separately whether they support, favor, or oppose increasing wind power and solar power, excuse me. And in those measures as well, we see that while there's a majority of Republicans, as well as a majority of Americans, saying that they favor increasing wind power and solar power, we saw about a 10-point drop among Republicans over just a 1 year period in terms of the degree to which they favor those renewable energy sources. So it's always hard to pinpoint the precise reasons for these kinds of shifts, but it does coincide with that change in presidential administrations and what has been really a widely expected shift in the policy environment as well related to climate and energy policies. So let me go ahead and move to the next slide, please. In our most recent survey, we also kind of asked people, how far would you be willing to go? So here again, just a trade-off question. We found a limited appetite among Americans for the idea of breaking with fossil fuels altogether. Instead, about 2/3 of Americans said they supported the idea of using a mix of fossil fuel sources and renewable energy sources. About a third said they favored phasing out fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas altogether. And then underneath, what you see are very wide differences by party, by political party, with Democrats really closely divided in their views over this, but Republicans largely in favor of continued reliance on a mix of fossil fuel and renewable energy sources. And if we could look at the next slide, you'll see that there are also age differences on this kind of metric. Younger adults, particularly those under 40 or 50, are more open to the idea of phasing out fossil fuels altogether. That's true among both Republicans and Democrats, though, as you might expect, there's much more support among Democrats of all ages than there are Republicans for this idea. But this as well, I think, is what's kind of new on the horizon, the idea of really making that trade-off between fossil fuels and renewable energy. So go ahead and move us to the next slide, please. And we've also asked about a number of different policy proposals over the years. So these are proposals discussed as a way to help reduce climate change. Each row is a separate question, as I think you'll see on all of these slides. And what you're seeing in the top two rows in particular is really widespread support for a number of proposals. The first being planting 1 trillion trees to help absorb carbon emissions. And the second, offering a tax credit for businesses to help develop carbon capture technology. Both of those proposals were ideas that had also been on the agenda for the Republican caucus in the past year or so. And actually, if we could add the next slide, you'll see that they capture widespread public support as well as majorities of both Republicans and Democrats. Down below, you see these other proposals. There's a little more of a partisan division, but even there, you're seeing about half or more Republicans support each of these. Look in the middle there, you see a 58% majority of Republicans saying that they favor tougher restrictions on power plant carbon emissions, as do, of course, 91% of Democrats. So I think one of the takeaways from these kind of data is to remember that even with what has been a really long history of partisan divides over many climate and energy issues, there have also been these areas of agreement between what are sometimes thought of as rank and file partisan groups. And we're seeing that even in the most recent survey here. So let's go to the next slide then. I want to turn our attention to another dynamic in the climate policy debates that really connects with the idea that extreme weather events are happening more frequently and they're with more intensity because of climate change. So we asked people just a month ago whether they'd experienced extreme weather events where they live in the past year. And on the left-hand side, you see some variation in how people are experiencing extreme weather events. That's kind of what you'd expect. Here we're using the census regional divisions to better understand people's local experience. And you see a bump there in the South Central area where I think roughly 7 in 10 said they'd experienced extreme weather in the past year. That's the area that includes Texas, Louisiana, that had been kind of hard hit by Hurricane Ida and some other weather events. So that makes some sense. On the right-hand side is a different judgment, is asking people, in your view, do you think these extreme weather events are more common in the US than they were before? So you have three choices. They're happening more often, less often, or about the same. And there you see some regional variation, but not nearly as much. There's a common sense that these events are happening more frequently. So go ahead and go to the next slide. You'll see this again, that overall about 2/3 of Americans said that extreme weather events are happening more often today in the US. Now, underneath, you'll see that even though there were some differences in people's perceptions of extreme weather events based on where they live, you also see this kind of net effect of partisanship in terms of how they see extreme weather. So here you're seeing, especially on the right-hand side, Democrats, much more so than Republicans, think that extreme weather events are happening more often. About twice as many do so. And then let's turn to the next slide and think again about what people want the government to do about extreme weather events. Here's just a couple of measures that capture that idea. First, we just asked people kind of about government response to extreme weather. Here you're seeing a majority saying that they would be more concerned about that government won't go far enough to limit construction in areas that are at high risk for extreme weather events. But then down below, you see there are wide differences by politics, with roughly 8 in 10 Democrats being much more concerned the government won't go far enough. Republicans much more divided over that issue, with a 53% majority saying that they were more concerned that government will go too far in limiting construction in these high-risk areas. Down below, you see there's really only a modest effect of having experienced an extreme weather event in your local area with views about this. So I think this kind of finding really speaks to, number one, of course, the strong correlate of politics and political lens on these kinds of policy issues. And it reminds us of what have often been kind of fundamental differences between Republicans and Democrats over the role and approach of government involvement. And then let's go to the next slide. Here's just another example of this when there's been a lot of attention to infrastructure proposals and needs right now. We asked about a number of these. I'm just pulling out one that connects with extreme weather here. And what you're seeing is that about half of Americans consider the idea of addressing kind of extreme building standards in connection with extreme weather, with the idea of setting stricter standards so that buildings would better be able to withstand extreme weather events. About half of Americans called that very important to them personally in thinking about infrastructure needs. And then down below that, you see, as we've seen before, that Democrats much more likely to consider that very important than Republicans. And really only a modest connection with people's direct experiences with extreme weather. So through it all, you do still see that partisan lens that is shaping how people think about these policies in the US. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Carol Doherty, who's our Director of Political Research, and I think he'll walk us through public support for policy action on climate today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carol Doherty, as Carrie said, and I'm the Director of Domestic Political Research here at Pew Research Center. And I'd like to just talk about where climate change ranks among the American public's priorities now, as we see. This obviously is an international issue, but it's also a domestic political issue, as we've seen in the United States. So we can go ahead and move to the next slide, please. Every year, we do a survey in the beginning of the year about the public's policy priorities. What do they see as important for Congress and the president to accomplish? And as you can see, climate change didn't rank very high this year, and it typically does not, given the other priorities that are facing the country, including the coronavirus and the economy, and a lot of concern about the economy, as well as some other issues, as well. And so you see, of 19 issues we asked about, it ranks 15th, with about 4 in 10 saying it should be a top priority for Congress and the president. That's not much different than recent years. We did see an increase in concern over climate change as expressed in these priority surveys in between 2010 and 2018. It's a little hard to know what's going on now. I think the coronavirus is actually scrambling things a little bit in terms of the public's priorities. Let's move to the next slide, please. And as you can see, as Carrie said, there's a huge partisan difference in terms of the priority that Democrats and Republicans attach to dealing with global climate change. Only 14% of Republicans versus 59% of Democrats. But I would point out that while Republicans, this is among the lowest, if not the lowest priority of those 19 issues we asked about among Republicans, again, placing very low priority on this. Democrats, though, were conflicted, and I think you see this reflected as well in some of the debates occurring now in Congress in the Democrats' $3.5 trillion social spending proposal, which includes a lot of climate change funding. There are a lot of priorities for Democrats, and this is one of them. And, dealing with coronavirus, the economy, many other priorities for Democrats. And so while Republicans typically rank it as a low priority, it is among the leading priorities for Democrats, but it also shares space with other priorities. Let's move to the next slide, please. So another way to go after this issue is we typically and often ask about the problems facing the United States, and again to get some sort of measure of salience. What are the big problems facing the United States? And again, climate change ranks among many other problems, including things like violent crime, which we've seen concerns growing about in the United States, and gun violence, as well as the coronavirus and racism. So again, it competes with other issues in the U.S. context. And go to the next slide, please. And again, you see the same pattern here of partisanship, but it's among the most polarizing issues we ask about climate change. But there are others as well, including racism and now even the coronavirus outbreak, the severity of that. But you can see it here as well. This is the gap between the percentage of Republicans and Democrats who call this a very big problem facing the United States, and that's just a very wide difference. But Democrats see other problems as well, and this is why it's not a standalone issue for Democrats at this point. And so, can we go to the next slide, please? And just a quick word about age and priorities. As Carrie noted, there is more concern about climate change among younger adults in the United States. But as you can see here, the gap is not terribly wide. I mean, it ranks higher for young adults, but they have other priorities as well, including economic inequality, racism, and crime. You can see, though, that when you look at the oldest adults, the 65 and older, it ranks much lower and is sort of overwhelmed by the violent crime and illegal immigration concerns that they have. So there is an age gap there, and it's consistent across a lot of issues. But again, the young adults have competing priorities. We can go to the next slide. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jacob Pauster, who will put this into an international context.
Well, thank you very much, Carol, and thank you for all that fascinating data. And so most of what you're going to see on the next couple slides comes from a survey of 17 advanced economies over the last year. And we're going to look at how the United States fits into the cross-national comparative research, but also on some of the effects of the geopolitical environment on views towards handling of climate change. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So as you can see, generally views about climate change as a threat have increased in recent years. And this is across many of the countries that we survey. So since we started asking this question about climate change as a threat in 2013, we've seen a 29 percentage point increase in France, a 23 percentage point increase in the UK, and even an increase in the US, 17 percentage points as of spring of last year. So there's definitely a sense that climate change is a concern as a major threat to people's countries. And this is even in relation to issues like the spread of infectious diseases, terrorism, cyber attacks. Climate change really does rank as a top threat. In addition, people are concerned that climate change will personally harm them at some point in their lifetime. And when you look at within country, you see that younger people, women, and those on the left ideologically, politically, are more concerned about climate change overall. So even with the cross-national differences, there are differences within countries. Now, next slide, please. Despite these concerns about climate change, there's not necessarily a sense that actions to deal with climate change will benefit economies in these countries very much. In fact, it's sort of a mixed view. Many say that actions taken by the international community to deal with climate change will have no effect on their economy, but up to a third in places like the US, Canada, France say that these actions will actually harm their economies. On the other hand, places like Sweden, South Korea are much more likely to say that actions to address climate change will actually benefit their economies. But overall, this sort of mixed sense that actions will not necessarily benefit at least the economies of these countries over the long term is a kind of issue that's been percolating across the world. Next slide, please. And because of this, what you see is that there's not a lot of confidence in the international community to deal with climate change. Now, so in France, almost 2/3, in the US, 54%, say that they're not confident in the international community taking action to address climate change. It's 52% median across these 17 publics versus 46% who are confident in the international community's ability to handle climate change. And I will say this too, that despite that sort of a little more doubting about the international community, there are a couple countries like Germany, Netherlands, South Korea, and Singapore, where majorities do say that they're confident in the international community's ability to handle climate change, and that's something that sort of affects how the COP26 event will be seen around the world, because we see from our other research that while people have pretty positive views of international organizations, there are doubts about how effective they can be and whether they actually listen to people, whether they actually take into account the interests of people like them when making policy decisions. And I think that all comes into effect when thinking about this issue of climate change especially. Next slide, please. And we see here too that there's mixed views of sort of world organizations and countries when it comes to dealing with climate change. So in general, medians across these 17 publics, say that the EU is doing a good job of dealing with climate change. Generally, people say the same about the UN, although lesser amount. views towards their own country's handling of climate change is a bit mixed. I'll go into that in more detail later. But you can see here too the main carbon emitters in the world, the United States and China, are both perceived as doing a particularly bad job in dealing with climate change. And for the United States, this is despite the fact that views towards the United States and confidence in the US president have actually increased dramatically over the last year. And views of China, on the other hand, have gotten a lot more negative among these 17 publics over the last couple of years. So combine that, and you see a pretty negative evaluation of the two world's leading emitters of carbon in terms of their efforts to reduce the effects of climate change over time. Next slide, please. When you look at attitudes towards the UN and the EU on an individual level, what you see is that there's a lot of differences, but generally people like how the EU is handling climate change. Germany is actually the lowest at 45%, but for the most part, majorities in most countries really think that the European Union is a leader in terms of dealing with climate change in this current year. Now, the views towards the UN are a bit more mixed. As I said earlier, views towards the UN are generally positive in many of these countries. But overall, there's a pretty wide swath of attitudes towards the UN's handling of climate change, with Germans only 36% saying that they're doing a good job, all the way up to Singaporeans, where 69% say that they're doing a good job. I will note that attitudes towards the UN are very closely tied to trust, not just trust in international organizations, but trust within the own country, societal trust. So generally, those who have more trust tend to have more faith in these international organizations. But as we know from our other research, trust in organizations, especially domestic organizations, are not always particularly high. And that's especially the case in the United States right now. Next slide, please. And then when it comes to attitudes towards their own country's handling of climate change, it's sort of a mixed bag, but generally positive. Swedes, the Brits, Singaporeans, New Zealanders, Canadians are all especially confident in their own country's ability to deal with climate change. But on the other hand, about half of Americans, half of Italians, South Koreans, Taiwanese, all say that their country is doing a bad job of handling climate change. One interesting thing about this data, too, is that while people on the left are generally more concerned about climate change and the harm that it could potentially do to them, those on the right here are actually more confident in their own country's ability to handle climate change, which also sort of represents the lesser concern that you see among those on the ideological right, where at the same time you also see a lot of young people being a lot more concerned about climate change, but generally a little more happy with how it's being dealt with in these various countries. And my next slide will actually go into how the details of how these countries view the United States and China on this issue. And again, when you look at it down to the details, overall, more people say that the United States is doing a good job of dealing with climate change, but the numbers are much lower than they are for the EU, the UN, or for their own country. And again, that's despite a jump in favorability towards the United States with the election of President Biden. But you also see that the ratings for China in this particular regard are very low. Only 7% in Germany, Japan, South Korea say that China is doing a good job of handling climate change. And you generally see lower ratings for China over the last couple of years, but on climate change, these are very low numbers. So there's not a lot of faith among these publics in sort of the world leaders in terms of tackling climate change, but overall a little more faith in the international organizations that will be at COP26. And with that, you can go to my next slide, which is the end of our slideshow. So we can turn it back over to James, who can start talking and answering questions from the audience with all this new research that we were able to show you today.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Carrie. Just an amazing amount of information has just been presented, and the audience has my sympathy. A lot to digest. One of the ways we hope we can collectively and together digest some of the data and what it might mean is by asking questions. And questions are already starting to come in. So I just want to remind everyone in attendance that you can ask questions through the suggestion box on the side of your screen. And please take advantage of that as a way to help our conversation along and to get the most out of this webinar for yourselves. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our special guest, Laura Helmuth. I got one question already I just want to quickly address, and then maybe we'll turn to some substantive questions with Laura leading us in that conversation. Question was about methodology. Part of it I can answer quickly, which is, how did you design these surveys? The details are all on our website. There'll be links after the event that you can follow. But just in general, so people know, our work is based on scientifically designed, random, probability-based surveys. So these are representative at a national level, is how they're designed. And that includes our international work in each of the countries, but also in the United States. And then as far as how many people were surveyed in each survey, that will vary. Internationally, I know it's roughly 1,000 people per country. The numbers are larger in the United States. If I can just get Carol and Carrie very quickly on screen to tell us quickly the size of the surveys that they each were referencing just for a minute, and then I would turn to Laura.
I'd say roughly around 10,000 in the US surveys. It does vary depending on each one, but about that.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, the good thing is that we now have the American Trends Panel, online panel for our domestic work, and the sample sizes are very large.
Thank you both. And the American Trends Panel reference is our main platform, our almost exclusive platform for our research in the United States when it comes to public opinion research. And the details about that are also available, and we can have links to that on our website. Thank you for that question already on methodology. Now I'd like to introduce our very special guest, Laura Helmuth, who is currently editor-in-chief of Scientific American. She's been active in the realm of science journalism for more than 20 years, has experience in the fields of health, science, technology, and the environment. Prior to Scientific American, she was the science and health editor for the Washington Post and has held positions at National Geographic, Slate, Smithsonian Magazine, and Science Magazine. And I should also mention that she served as president of the National Association of Science Writers from 2016 to 2018, and as a board member from 2012 to 2016. Laura, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a privilege and honor, and just excited to hear some of your thoughts and observations. And I'm just going to be a little biased and ask first, what do you think of our research? Like, what did you find most fascinating or surprising? And I'll give it over to you now.
Thank you. I love it. I mean, first of all, thank you so much for all the work that the Pew Research Center has been doing, this year and for years, to bring clarity to what people actually think about the most important issues in society. And I love that you call yourselves a fact tank. I think that's brilliant and accurate. As a journalist, we see a lot of survey material. A lot of it is not so trustworthy. But whenever anything comes out from Pew, first of all, I think all of us in science journalism open that email immediately, open the surveys immediately, look at the graphs, and then we talk about them all the time. It seems like every conference I go to that talks about science and society and policy and what matters in the world and who cares about what matters in the world, somebody always references a Pew study. Including just yesterday, I was at the National Academy of Medicine. They were having their annual meeting about getting policy to support health with a focus on equity, and we talked about Pew data. So in general, I love what you're doing. It's so important, and I think these in particular, like the studies that the three scientists reported just now, it's really hard to understand what people, to take the last one first, what people around the world think about climate or anything else, particularly during a pandemic when we just feel so isolated. We're not traveling, we're not having international guests or tourists, and so seeing how much consensus there is that this is important, that it's a global issue, that we're all, experiencing it more, that the future generations are going to experience it more. Like just having that kind of shared perspective is really interesting. And then of course, it's really interesting in each country to see how the demographics break down and how younger generations in particular are really concerned and really want to act on climate. And it's a polarizing issue in pretty much most of the places you look. So I think those are really important for understanding what the world is thinking as we go into the United Nations climate change meeting that starts at the end of this month.
Great. And I appreciate the kind words. We've certainly, as an institution, focused a lot of our energy on this topic because, as you point out, it is a globally relevant issue and one that concerns all of us as we think about the future. Um, as I listen to my colleagues, I can't help but note some of the really partisan and intense partisan divides in the United States. And I wonder if you have thoughts on, as you mentioned, COP26, US leadership on the international stage and the linkage, if any, you see between the fact that we have partisan divides as described by our research in the United States. How does that influence the ability of the United States to lead on the issue of climate change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And of course, any country's ability to lead or participate in global action depends on who their current leader is. And that can change. It's just a matter of a few votes here or there in various states. So that I mean, I think one reason that your work is so important is that it's showing what people really think, because it's hard to get between gerrymandering and threats to voting rights and in the way the electoral college is set up. It's really hard for other countries to understand what's happening in the U.S. and what people in the U.S. think. So, and likewise for us to understand what the true public opinions are in other countries. So knowing that there are people around the world who really care about this, I think, is super important, and especially for current office holders and for anybody who wants a future in politics, to know that younger generations take climate very seriously. It's a winning political issue. I think it's important for to keep kind of pushing that message for people from any party or anywhere in the world. And so I think that's really important as far as the U.S. leadership. Coming into COP, there's so much negotiation and diplomacy and kind of trust that's necessary, and that's one of the things that you're seeing is that kind of societal trust is such a good predictor of who thinks their government can do something, who thinks the global organizations can do something. And so I think the U.S. being trustworthy, being transparent, making real commitments, acting on those commitments will be really necessary to improve global trust and improve contributions and participation around the world.
Oh, thanks, Laura, very much for that. And there are a couple questions coming, and then I'll bring the researchers in. But one more for you. Because we're a fact tank and we don't recommend on policy, and we certainly try not to speculate about what will happen in the policy arena, I'm going to maybe unfairly ask you, since we've touched on COP26 now a couple times, and you just talked about some of the ways that public opinion matters to whether governments can act, and also just the confidence that citizens have that there will be actual actions that matter globally. I mean, what's your sense? We had an event a couple weeks back where was quite a bit of optimism about what COP26 could produce. So I'm not actually asking for a prediction, but heading into this event, what's your sense for the possibility of action and steps that matter?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think what happens in the next couple of weeks could make a difference. I think if people around the world are really pushing for their representatives to take COP seriously and to make real commitments, a lot, as with anything, people tend to do most of the work right on deadline. And so, as the deadline approaches for COP, and as the meeting commences, a lot of the decisions will be made kind of at the last minute. So, people who want to contact their representatives or advocate for taking this seriously, for making real commitments, this is a good time to act. People are listening more than they maybe were even a month ago. So I think that's important. There's some obviously some challenges of having COP during the pandemic. It was delayed a year, and so any action that's taken now is a year later than it would have been. And so time matters with climate change. any delay means that the future impacts just keep amplifying in sometimes unpredictable ways. So the time to act is now. The sooner the better. And one of the issues also during the pandemic is that you have an equity issue of communities and countries that have less access to vaccines are less able to attend in person, and in person is where a lot of the actual mechanics happens. So there's an equity issue there. I hope that the people who are able to attend will pay attention to the commitments and the issues and the concerns of people who aren't there, and also kind of be as inclusive and equitable as possible. There's still time to make real changes that will potentially reduce the amount and the disasterness of natural and unnatural disasters. And I think some of the important research you've done recently showing that people are experiencing and perceive that there are more disasters that are more serious that are driven by climate. I think that's really important. It's not some future abstract hypothetical issue. It's causing people to drown right now.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to now go through a few of the questions we're getting. They're coming in hot and heavy. And keep you in the loop. But I also want to bring in the researchers. One of the questions is about whether and this was addressed by Carrie to a certain degree in case of the United States, are we, citizens to corporations, ever really going to give up on fossil fuels? Carrie, how do you interpret those results you showed earlier in terms of the willingness of people to make that kind of significant, dramatic change?
Yeah, I think those data are really interesting and important because it's a choice that we're going to be increasingly faced with. It's not something we really asked about before because it really wasn't on the policy agenda, but you are seeing a shift in conversation around what are we going to do to address climate change and the idea that we might need to really to move off of what we have known as our core energy sources up to now. I think what we saw in that data and what we also saw connected with our favorite vehicle in the U.S., the car, the internal combustion engine car, was actually very similar in that overall Americans weren't quite ready for that. That was maybe more change than they were ready for at this point. But we did see younger generations tending to embrace that or be more open to it than older ones. So at least on a slow scale, it's possible that will continue to shift as we keep moving forward.
Thanks, Carrie. Another question gets back to this issue of how polarizing an issue climate change seems to be in the United States based on our data. And I think, a couple of questions are really people are wanting to understand is it as intense a divide as it is in other realms? Is there any area where our data is showing there might be more promise for some kind of cooperation, bipartisan action on something that is aimed at addressing climate change? I know Carrie and Carol, maybe you both want to take a turn at giving some further context. Carrie?
Sorry, I was going to let Carol go. I think that a couple of things. Number one is when you're just focused on climate, sometimes you forget that there's lots of issues where we have a political divide. And that's something that our political research has been quite good at showing us, that there's kind of widespread divides. And we've seen them for a couple of decades, right? But then sometimes people overgeneralize that and think everything's divided. And as we tried to go through, there are policy proposals where you can find common ground. At the same time, you do have these very strong partisan lenses through which people are seeing government action. So you can get to both places. There certainly on these issues, it's longstanding enough that we're expecting continued partisan divisions over these ideas. But there are areas where you can come to terms.
That's a great point, Carrie. Oh, sorry, James.
No,
that's a great point. Yeah, that the polarization that we see isn't limited to environment or climate. And in fact, if you looked 25 or 30 years ago in our data, you'd see very small partisan differences. This has happened on many issues over the last few decades, not just this particular one. But in terms of areas of possible agreement, I think there is in the sense that, when you see the two big pieces of legislation in Congress now intended to address this issue, the so-called infrastructure bill is not very controversial. It's been caught up in the negotiations over the other bill. I won't get in too much into legislative wrangling, but the fact is that the public as well. There's not much of a partisan divide in terms of it's not terribly high priority for Americans. Infrastructure is not, but it's not a terribly partisan one either. It's something that Republicans and Democrats see as a need, and in the sense that initiatives around the environment and climate can be put into the infrastructure basket, I think you see less partisanship there.
That's really fascinating and really helpful, Carrie and Carol, especially as you were saying, Carol. I don't want to make this sound superficial, but the context or the framing of the issue is important. And, survey questions get you answers about what you ask, right? So that's helpful for you to connect those dots. A follow-up question from another attendee at the webinar today is, we're focused on the national level. And in some ways, we're focused on the global level because it's a global issue. Anything from our data, either directly on environment or more broadly, Carrie or Carol, and I'll start with you, Carol, that says maybe at the state or local level, there's a little more room for bipartisan or cooperative efforts? Anything that suggests the politics are different at the state or local level?
Well, I'm not, as you say, we take mostly a national perspective, and I'll defer to Carrie on this, but you can certainly see how the extreme weather events vary by region, among other things. And I think for some states and jurisdictions, this is basically an existential issue, as we've seen over the last 6 months to a year with these extreme weather events. So I imagine that is very much the case, and it depends on where you live. If you're in California right now, wildfires aren't an abstract issue at all. It's something that affects your daily life.
Carrie, anything to add?
Yeah, I think we certainly look for it quite often. And of course, these regional areas, they have a different partisan mix, which can also influence what kind of state and local policies proceed. But that is certainly one of the reasons why we wanted to look at people's experience of extreme weather. I think where you're seeing really hard hit areas, such as we saw in South Central with about 7 in 10 Americans or Americans living in that region, saying that they had experienced extreme weather events, we didn't see much difference between Democrats and Republicans. They both said, yes, we experienced extreme weather events in the past year. In other areas, and most of the other regional divisions, you just saw that, Democrats more likely than Republicans living in the same general area to say they'd experienced that. So these things have changed over time. When the idea of extreme weather first came on the horizon, it wasn't a word particularly connected with climate change, but it's become more connected, and you're seeing more of that partisan tilt to how people interpret those events as a result.
That's a great segue to another question that we've gotten, and something I really wanted to get back to you, Laura, about, and that is, news and information about climate change. You sit in a position where you are responsible for editing scientific content for audiences, for Americans and others around the globe. I'd be interested in your perspective about, as Carrie said, extreme weather is now a term we're used to hearing. How has news and information about climate change? And, for our researchers, what about the sources that people are relying on? How much is that influencing whether they adopt one view or another about climate change? But Laura, maybe you could share some thoughts on just the nature of science, journalism and reporting around climate change.
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. And the framing really matters, and who you interview and what stories you choose to elevate really make a difference in what people understand about climate change and what can be done about it. And with climate science, the science has been pretty clear about the consequences of greenhouse gases. Like that's been clear for decades. And thanks to your work, we're seeing that the popular interest and concern about it is also getting there. And but it seems like policy is a little bit lagging. And I think science journalism can do a lot better. And sorry, just journalism in general. Basically, the climate should be everybody's beat. Every single thing we cover in news is related to climate. There's some side of it, whether it's sports, arts, whatever. So I think it's really important for just journalists in general to be climate literate and to show the connections to what they cover and how climate will impact that. And I think we're one of the important things that we can do is elevate the voices of experts and make it clear and help people understand what's happening and how it impacts them. And we're starting to kind of change the language that we use to talk about it. So we have a collaboration called Covering Climate Now that's a partnership of a whole bunch of publications around the world. And we've started calling it, instead of climate change or even a climate crisis, we're calling it a climate emergency, because of all the connotations that, in an emergency, you have to act, you have to do something. And so I think as the language is trying to shift to keep up with how quickly climate change is accelerating and with all the consequences it has for people's lives.
Thanks. And Carrie, I just ask you perhaps to comment on what, if anything, we've seen in our research about how news or information sources are associated or correlated with attitudes on climate.
Yeah, we actually asked, we tried to get at this kind of ongoing puzzle about why more people say that they care and they're concerned about climate change, but fewer people are actively involved. So we try to probe on that. How much are you actively doing something around climate change and paying attention to it? And we probed as well on whether or not they're paying attention on social media sources in particular, whether they see posts on social media that are urging action on climate change. And I'd say it was really kind of surprising how many people said they did see those kinds of posts. And again, particularly younger Americans were more likely to say they saw those kinds of posts. And of course, they had a mix of reactions to what they saw as well, with that, some talking about the anxiety that raises, but also some degree of confidence that we could still address climate change as well.
And then kind of a segue and trying to respond to several questions. Jacob, internationally, one of the findings I remember when this report first came out, this data that you were talking about, that one slide where talking about will it help or hurt our economy to address climate change, which I interpret as a bit of a comment on the promise of a new Green Deal. And we didn't use that terminology, to be clear, in our survey. A couple of questions are wondering about, is there any sense for why there's that variation to the degree that there is in terms of people in different countries having different attitudes about the upside of dealing with climate change? One person wondered if you're a resource-oriented economy, minerals, coal mining, is that kind of influencing your skepticism? I don't know if there's anything that you would want to add to some of that variation and skepticism overall about the promise of a new Green Deal, so to speak.
Well, I mean, I don't think I can answer very clearly why each country is different, but there is something that sort of runs throughout, and that's partisanship. So those on the political left are much more likely to say that actions to address climate change will benefit their economies rather than those on the ideological right. So those differences that we see in the United States in terms of partisanship do kind of exist in other countries. And that, I think, is why there's such a divide on that question. In the United States, it's 1/3 say, it will benefit versus 1/3 say it will harm, and versus 1/3 will say no impact. But in a place like Sweden, where there's a little more consensus about climate change, more people see it as a concern. more people do see it as a benefit to their economy to sort of act on climate change. So I think, as we're seeing it in most of this data, politics is kind of like a underlying issue that kind of dictates what you see here. And that can sometimes be consistent across countries and sort of explain why some of the variables are what they are. And it's also, too, some of the countries who are more likely to say that it will harm the economy are less positive on their own country's handling of climate change. So it could also be skepticism about having tried to act and maybe not achieving as much as people expect in the current leadership of their own countries.
Thanks for that. Your comment about politics, and it can vary from place to place. It can vary within a country, but also how there might be some patterns, as you're saying, ideological differences are showing up in more than one country. Maybe partisanship is more extreme in the US, but it's not unique to the United States, to your point. I would just add, we got a couple questions about, did we survey in China and India? To be clear, we did not. We're not excluding them from the survey data that we reported. And so, to be direct and transparent, this is a very advanced economy heavy set of data. It's part of the world. It's not the whole world. But a year ago, we were fortunate enough to work with the UN and address climate change as part of a wider agenda of global dialogues about pressing issues. And I would note that in the context of that partnership, we did get a chance to understand more of what people in, we'll call it the global South, were saying about climate change. And while it is a concern, kind of like what Carol was saying about the United States, it wasn't the most pressing or immediate concern. Education, health were more pressing often. So it's a reminder, and I think Laura was touching on this, representing the widest variety of voices is important when you think about an event like COP26, because it's a threat, climate change, to many people's eyes, but it's not necessarily the policy priority, right? So before we finish, and mindful of time, Laura, I want to give you one last question, which is, we've gotten a few that are basically, what can individuals do that's most helpful in thinking about, actions to reduce the global climate emergency? Any thoughts or observations based on your scientific knowledge and the people you're talking to? If you're an individual, what can you do?
Yeah, really good question. And people, I think some of your surveys have shown that people are willing and are doing things to try and reduce their carbon footprint, whether it's, pay more attention to how they commute, how much they travel, what they consume, do they eat less meat? These are all things that individuals can do. But, whenever my other, environment and sustainability and society editors talk to experts about this, the answer is always vote and push for policies, because the real change is going to happen at the large structural, energy infrastructure levels, and with global commitments and global cooperation. So it's I wish we could all fix it just by caring more or trying more, but it does seem to be out of individuals' control in a lot of ways.
Well, thanks for that perspective. I mean, for us, that's really helpful to hear, because our agenda and research really is focused on citizens and being policy relevant. And you kind of just underscored why the research that we're sharing today is important to consider, because we are talking about what citizens believe, as you said, Laura, what they're willing to do. And I appreciate your point about voting. I mean, a lot of this comes down to, Jake said, politics. Carol focused on policy, and Carrie was underscoring how people have come to look at these issues differently over time. So mindful of time, I need to say thank you to everyone. We're winding down. So Laura, thank you so much for joining us today and having a wonderful conversation. Carrie, Carol, and Jacob, thank you so much for being wonderful colleagues and bringing so much to the table today. And thank you for everyone in attendance today. Reminder, everything we're doing is recorded. It will be on our website very shortly, and there are links there to all the things we've been talking about. Thank you so much for joining us today. Take care, everyone.